This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
Why do you think there's more kids that are sick than before?
Again, I think it comes down to that sort of multifactorial lifestyle and environment.
What do you think the implications of giving these foods to young children are?
It's an incredible strain on the immune system.
Why do you think people are so disconnected from what's going on in their bodies?
I think we just live in such a fast-paced community, a fast-paced life at the moment.
What do you think about the emotional stress that comes with doing that kind of regimen and being so obsessed about what we eat and how much of it we're eating and calories and all of that?
Yeah, I think that just raises stress levels.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the healing journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? Welcome to the Expert Series, where you'll meet 25 of the world leaders in health and wellness, discussing their passions and what it takes to make your shift.
There's an electrical feeling in the room.
I had to be a mom. It was so important to me.
I've always been a pain in the butt, and I love that.
I knew that I wanted to help people.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift. Hi, I'm Katherine Maslen, naturopath, author and host of The Shift. In the Expert Series, we share the insights, stories and expertise of each of our amazing experts. You might have met them on season 1 of The Shift, where we took snippets of these conversations and put them together into the series. If you haven't listened to season 1 yet, I'd recommend going back and listening to episode 1 on what it takes to make a shift in your gut health. We'll provide a link in the show notes. In this episode of The Shift, we have the wonderful Jenny Tschiesche, also known as the Lunchbox Doctor. Jenny is one of the UK's leading nutrition experts and a renowned advocate and advisor around healthy eating for kids. She is a best-selling author, having published multiple books, including Gut Health and Probiotics, and cookbooks such as Sheet Pan Cooking and the soon-to-be-released Real Lunchtime Foods. Jenny has been developing recipes for years, as well as providing nutrition and dietary advice for a wide range of people, including top athletes, sporting bodies, people dealing with illness, and parents and their kids. She is regularly featured across the media in the UK and is a passionate voice in the health movement there. There is so much to learn in this episode, but some of my favourite parts are the discussion we have around the rise of allergies in children, what should be in our kids' lunchboxes, the hazards of counting calories, and her time spent in Botswana amongst wild animals. First up, I asked Jenny to introduce herself.
My name is Jenny Tschiesche, but I'm also known as the Lunchbox Doctor, and I'm a nutritionist, but I have a real passion for helping families and children understand more about how they can optimize their health through nutrition, but as part of the whole, nourishing the whole being. So nutrition's just part of it, but that's my bag. So that's how I try and help people. I started training in nutrition in 2003, and I completed my degree, having had 2 children along the way, in 2009. And we didn't touch on gut health a huge amount. And I understand why, because that's when a lot of research was just coming out and we were just starting to understand more about the connections between gut and other elements of the body. But it was actually during that process that I started to look at my own gut health and started to do some testing. And that's what made me want to go a little bit further and understand more. And certainly, having wanted to understand more, having understood more, I realised how connected gut health is to every aspect of our well-being, or so many other aspects than one might consider. It's not just about having poor digestive health. But my real passion comes in trying to make sure people understand why and what they can do about it. Because we do have this sort of window of opportunity, I believe, which is to get it right, from pre-birth through to birth, and from birth through to when children go to school. That's our sort of prime window of getting it right. And how many parents have time to get that education then? They don't. So I'm on a bit of a mission to try and help educate people, but not in a finger pointy way. It's more of a, this is how it could be done way.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your personal health story, though? Because this is sort of a bit of the reason why you've come to be where you are today. So can you start from the start for me?
I was very, very sporty as a child, and I absolutely would just anything that involved a ball, I would be there. I wasn't a runner. I wasn't up for cross-country running or anything like that. But if there was a goal to be scored or points to be scored and it involved me, a ball, a team, I was there. And I absolutely loved any sport, but I played National League hockey, I played county volleyball, I played club tennis, and just loved life. And then I went to university. In my first year at university, I got really sick actually, with glandular fever. I hadn't realised how poorly I was. I was telling one of my children about it the other day because I actually went to a lecture and was told by my lecturer in no uncertain terms that I had to get to hospital. And when I arrived at the hospital, they were waiting for me with a stretcher. So I got taken in and put on drips and literally spent I went home back to my parents' house, and I spent months recovering. Went back to university, carried on trying to live the life I had been, but I just wasn't focusing, I wasn't cooperating, it wasn't doing me any good. But I managed to get through that year and went to live in France for the third year of my degree, and that's when I really started focusing on food, and that's when I realised the power of food and what it could do to help me. And it started to make sense that cooking from scratch actually made me feel a whole lot better. I was playing, again, National League hockey over there and absolutely loving it. I wasn't drinking any alcohol, which I had been at university, started to look after my body. But I think I had damaged my microbiome. I didn't know enough about it by then. And so when I went to Africa, I've been to Tunisia, I've been to Seychelles, been to Northern Africa. And each time I came back with something. Ultimately, when I tested, I'd come back with parasites, 2 parasites that clearly should not have been there in the levels that they were. And so I set about healing my gut with the best of my knowledge. It's taken a long, long time to get to where I am now. You know, a lot of healing, a lot of research, a lot of understanding, some getting things wrong and some getting things right. But because I realized how poorly I could have been and how poorly I've seen other people in the same situation as me. Don't forget, I see other people in a similar profile to me, and I see how poorly they are when they come through the door of my clinic. And I think, wow, I was lucky that I was able to understand what was wrong with me when I was and how young I was when I got those results, and that I could do something about it. Because sometimes people don't do anything about it. They go so far down the line that they end up so sick they can barely get out of bed.
How old were you when you went to Africa?
Oh, gosh, from early 20s right through to sort of mid-20s. And I've been subsequently, and I've been absolutely fine. So I was just in the situation where I was the one that was prone. I was numerous other people who were fine, but I was able to pick up anything because my immune system was so shot to pieces that, come and get me.
What were you doing in Africa?
So one of my really good friends is an elephant researcher in Botswana. So I was out there sort of helping her for a period of time. Another one was a field trip, and another time just on holiday.
What was it like being around the elephants?
Amazing. Yeah. So at the time this was when she was pre-PhD, she was doing a project on lions. So we were literally tracking lions. So we were standing on top of, a Land Rover in the middle of Botswana, and the lion is 5 meters from you, and you just think this is not the safari. This is the real thing. There's no one around you that could help protect, but it's amazing. So yeah, it's an amazing place to be, and just to be amongst all of those wild animals is incredible.
Oh, absolutely brilliant. Like, what a fantastic experience. What did you pick up in Africa?
Yeah, so I had Blastocystis hominis and Dientomoeba fragilis. And also, unsurprisingly, my bacteria, so Lactobacillus, Bifidobacterium, were out of balance as well. And on some of the tests I did several because I wanted to know that I was getting better. Some yeast would appear and then it would go away. And so I had to do a lot to do with, just cutting out the foods that were causing me problems, healing the gut, and then repopulating the gut, the sort of classic approach, really.
Were you a nutritionist at this point?
I was, yes. It's just post-training, yeah.
Yeah, okay. What made you want to study nutrition?
So when I was playing hockey, when I was 14 or 15, I remember I was selected as one of the top 45 in my age group in the UK. And so I went to this camp, and at that stage, so I'm the youngest of 7 children. So my family, in the nice sense, there wasn't time to really focus on food and what it could do, but equally we couldn't afford to eat processed food. So it was 3 meals a day. which is great. But I'd never made that correlation between what you eat and outcome, more energy or better performance on the pitch. And so I was given a diet sheet, and it really, really intrigued me. And I thought, wow, gosh, what we put in really does make a difference to what we get out. And that's when I started to get really interested in it. But it wasn't until, I went to a very kind of strict senior school where pretty much your degree, which I know is unlike, because I subsequently went to live in Sydney, and they were like, what, you're here for business and you didn't read business at university? And I was like, no, I read geography with European studies, So it is very strange, the system we have here, but it's basically you go through school and you choose one of what we call our A-levels, what you take your exams for when you're 18, you choose that for your degree. And I never thought about doing nutrition. It wasn't even on anywhere, in my sort of spectrum. So it was only later when I started to think, right, I'm really interested in this, and I had a really big problem with my back, and I had to stop playing hockey. And I thought, right, what am I going to do with all this extra time that I have? Because playing National League hockey takes a lot of time. So if you're not playing that anymore, what are you going to do with all this time? Well, I decided I'd study, and then very, very quickly got pregnant. So.
What was it like when you graduated? Like, when was the moment that you realised that this stuff really works?
Oh, gosh. Well, very early on, I had a couple of people who'd been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes but weren't on medication, that went back for retesting and realised that they no longer were type 2 diabetic, which is amazing. But I think the biggest one for me was actually a gut health case where a lady had come to me and she had rheumatoid arthritis, and we did stool testing and realized that she had, an imbalance of bacteria, she had a parasite, and we worked really hard, and she had a baby soon after. And it was amazing because she hadn't been able to have children, and she was really, it was very much affecting her mental health. And so to now have a child was fantastic. And I suppose for me, I'm very lucky that I haven't had problems with fertility, but knowing how it's affected my friends and friendship group, to be able to help people who haven't been able to conceive is an incredible thing. That's when you really go, wow, how powerful is this? What we put into our mouths really does make a difference to our overall goings on the inside.
What is the biggest issue that you're seeing with health in the UK at the moment?
I think people just trying to fast track. They've got themselves into whatever the situation is, whether it's that they're overweight, whether it's, increasingly I'm seeing cases of Lyme disease, people being affected by fibromyalgia, and even in some cases things like MS, where people are being diagnosed with big, serious illnesses that are so far down the track, and they're not necessarily able to take that really long journey to get out of that. I'd love for people not to be in that situation in the first place, but if they are, it's about trying to help people get out of that situation. But I just think part of that is because the messages that we receive are so skewed towards quick fix, whether it's, from sort of weight loss and diet supplements, or whether it's low calorie, low sugar, or whether it's, all the messages around veganism and vegetarianism and keto and paleo. And, people struggle. It's just too complicated and too much. So they'd rather not do that. They'd rather go and get some medication, or they'd rather just accept that they can't do it, but they can do stuff about it. And I think that's so important, but it is a bit of a slog.
How do you help them to navigate that journey?
Well, I don't see a huge number of clients, but I think you attract generally the right people to work with. So I'll be honest, I don't think for a moment that I am the best coach in the world. I don't think I'm the most patient coach in the world. So there are certain people that just wouldn't get on with working with me, but I'm quite black and white, matter of fact about things. And certainly, the success stories I've had have been great, but that's because I guess we worked well together. Our personalities matched and that worked. But, along the way, other people I've actually proposed a better person for some people to work with, because I think they need more than I can give, quite frankly, So that's me being very open and honest. But I think it's a tough one because, we know that when you're that sick, you are not only sick physically, but you've been pretty pummeled mentally as well. And if there's a disruption to the microbiome, there's going to be a disruption to your mental health as well. And we know that with that imbalance, some decisions are harder to come by. Some things are harder to stick to. So you do need a lot of help along the way. And even if, they start to get amazing results. Sometimes they sabotage because that's the sort of forbidden fruit element. And, why wouldn't we have cake when everyone else is having cake? Oh, hold on, you haven't had cake for 6 months. Why would you have cake when everyone else is having cake? But we do sabotage them. And that's a human sort of condition, I think. And you're right. If we can support people through that, that's going to be a far better situation for them.
And I think the other really interesting and also disappointing thing is that often people will be peer pressured into doing the wrong thing, have a drink, come on, don't worry about it. Just one piece of cake, it's not going to hurt you. And it's that kind of lack of support, I think, sometimes that people can really struggle with as well.
I see it with, with some celiac children and the number of schools that don't take celiac anywhere near seriously enough. And the child, ends up having the cake that somebody's brought in for a birthday, or ends up being given something in the school canteen which has got gluten in it, and they're really poorly. But the school doesn't understand that. And again, that comes down to education and understanding. But also, we are increasingly experiencing these issues. There are more children with celiac disease now than ever before. There are more children with allergies now than ever before. And as a society, we've got to work out how to manage that.
Why do you think there's more kids that are sick than before?
Again, I think it comes down to that sort of multifactorial lifestyle and environment, from the overuse of antibiotics, homes that are too clean, using the wrong kind of products. We have so many more toxins in our environment than we ever had before. There's so many people on this earth, just like we're in London right now, and, it's manic. There's just people, there's pollution, there's smoke, there's vaping going on around you, there's pollution from the cars, which, more and more cars on the road, although apparently that's going to change soon.
Oh, what's happening with that?
So a new congestion charge apparently in April, which means that people are going to be charged about £100 to come into the centre with their cars. But I think there are so many aspects to this, and certainly the way that crops are grown is making a difference, and the way that we process food. I mean, I do harp on about the bread issue because I think it's a really important one. I don't think the number of people that say to me, "Oh, it's great because we've moved from white bread to whole grain bread," and I'm like, well, what kind of bread is it? Can you crunch it up into a ball? Does it arrive in a cellophane package? Does it still not have mold after 4 days? Is it still soft after 4 days? And they can say yes to those things, and I realise that they're eating bread that actually is probably damaging as opposed to nourishing.
If this episode is leaving you wanting more, I'll be hosting a live webinar on gut health. Join me and get the opportunity to get your gut health questions answered. Go to theshiftclinic.com/webinar. See you there.
What do you think about people going gluten-free and then just switching to gluten-free products?
Terrible. I think it's terrible. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? Because we're a money-oriented society, and if there's profit to be made, people will make a profit. Hence, all the processed vegan foods, all of the processed gluten-free foods, all of the processed dairy-free milks and things. The reality is, I always say to people, if you are diagnosed or you want to go gluten-free, see it as an opportunity to change your eating habits. Don't try and keep exactly the same eating habits. Think about it as an opportunity to take bread out of the lunch. How many other places in the world would you have wheat for every single meal, for example? How many other places in the world do you drink as much milk, cow's milk, as we do? I'm not anti, dairy products at all. I think they're really helpful for a lot of people, but I do think it's important that people just stand back for a moment and just think about what we're doing to our bodies. Just think about the effect of putting that in your body.
So let's talk about then what happens with babies when they have foods introduced, because I know that in Australia, and it's probably the same here, some of the first things we're giving babies are things like teething rusks, which are made from wheat, farro, which is like a wheat porridge, and dairy products, really, really common. What do you think the implications of giving these foods to young children are?
It's an incredible strain on the immune system. We know from even wheat, let's just take wheat as one small, very large subject. This is one foodstuff which has changed beyond recognition in such a short period of time in the scale of evolution. I talk to people about even something as simple as bread and the process of bread making, which hugely changed in 1961 with the introduction of the Chorley-Wood method. So that means a fast rising process. It means that bread is going to be much more glutinous. It's going to have a higher yeast content. But the wheat itself is much higher yielding, faster growing. It's much more exposed to the effects of herbicides, pesticides. We're using this terrible thing, glyphosate on our wheat, which is something that I believe is causing disruption to the shikimate pathway and is causing gut health issues in numerous people. And so wheat in its own right seems to be damaging guts. In perfect gut health, they seem to be okay. And of course, if they have the enzyme that can break down the sugars in milk and dairy proteins, we're fine. But there are so many people that aren't in perfect gut health and they don't quite realize it.
So what is the ideal diet for an infant when they begin to start having food?
I mean, you want it to be diverse, and obviously we've moved. I know when I was pregnant with my children, it was no nuts. Don't eat any nuts, don't give them any nuts. And now we're saying eat nuts through pregnancy. And we want it to be diverse. But what I am seeing is when we do introduce things, if there is atopic ailments in the parents, quite often it seems to step up a gear and be even worse in the next generation. You still want to be introducing foods, but you want to be aware that we are increasingly an allergic population. And so as diverse as possible without causing any damage would be my sort of go-to. But I would say that, you want to be careful with things like highly processed. You want to be careful with gluten. And I would certainly ease in with less gluten-containing grains or non-gluten-containing grains to start with. And I would certainly ease in with things like fermented foods. And if we can get fermented foods into babies as soon as we can, great.
How do you think the best way to get fermented foods into babies is?
If we look at just things that actually taste great, if you've never had sugar, you're not going to know any different. I don't think we should ever be giving sweetened yogurts to children, certainly not at a young age. But things like kefir or unsweetened yogurt, they're great tasting foods. Those that do have a problem with dairy, of course, there's other things. There's coconut kefir or water kefir. There's coconut yogurt and things like that.
You mentioned that people are getting worse atopy and worse sort of allergic type things as they go through the generations. Why is that happening?
I think there are multiple reasons. And I find myself having to be so careful with this because if you say anything about, for example, our homes are too clean, we don't let our children play outside enough, all of these things can seem like you're blaming someone for something they did wrong. But I think all of those things could contribute to poor gut health. And once we have poor gut health, we are exposing our bodies to much more inflammation and increased possibilities of allergy. So when I do think, when I say, a parent might have an allergy, it might be hay fever, or it might be an allergy to cats or dogs or something like that. Then the next generation, it just seems to get that bit worse, whether it is eczema or whether it's a food allergy or whether it's a severe food intolerance. But that's what we're seeing. And I think it's because of all of those factors. It's both lifestyle and environmental.
What other kind of foods do you think we need to be feeding our kids to nurture their microbiome?
Prebiotics are something that people don't necessarily understand the reasons, why. I mean, we're all told we need to, and certainly in this country, 5 a day, you need to be having your 5 a day, which actually is just sort of plucked out of the air and something that the government thought we could achieve. And so few of us are. 1 in 10 children seem to be achieving that. So we're not doing too well with that. So what we need to do is think about foods that have got fiber in them, but we need the fruits, vegetables, plant-based foods that have got complex carbohydrates and include the skin in that as well. So, the skin of vegetables and fruits. Yes, whole grains, but as I mentioned, I would introduce those slowly to younger children so that we're not introducing the gluten-containing grains too young. And certainly resistant starch, which is one of those things, again, people don't necessarily know about or hear about. Things like underripe bananas, plantain flour as well, using those sort of things. And resistant starch can also be cooked and cooled starches, so rice, pasta, all of those sort of things that, again, people might not think of as particularly healthy. We now know that if we cook, cool, and even if we reheat some of those starchy foods, we're going to get resistant starch, and that can help feed the probiotics in the gut, providing there's good enough balance of probiotics there to start with.
And what are the things that people need to be looking out for to avoid with their children so that they don't damage that delicate microbiome?
Not too much sugar would be my primary concern. As a society, we have been led to believe, for example, that breakfast cereal is breakfast. And certainly when we look at what breakfast cereal contains, it's not only refined grains in most cases, without too much fiber and without protein, but also increasingly they contain vast amounts of sugar and would actually be considered confectionery. So I would say start at the beginning of the day and think about alternatives which are lower in sugar, less processed as well. Let's get back to real food. So sugar and processed food would be my primary concern, and the areas I would look to and advise other parents to look to reduce significantly in their children's diets in order to make sure that they don't do any further damage to an potentially already damaged gut.
So tell me a little bit about the culture here in the UK. What's going on here at the moment with that?
So in the UK, we have something called the traffic light system. Not all brands have to or will take part in the traffic light system. Some cereal brands, for example, are and some aren't. But it is, again, quite confusing because when you look at, for example, the fat content of almonds, it's going to come up really high. It's going to be red, as in danger, don't eat it, which is crazy because we know that if you looked at the fat content of a sausage roll versus the fat content of some almonds, who's going to, say that the sausage roll is better or whatever. So you need to be careful with the traffic light system, but it's certainly something that people are pushing for here to help certain people understand that a high sugar cereal of 40 grams of sugar per 100 grams of product is not a good thing, or alternative sugars, which again, we know have been shown to affect the microbiome. Artificial sweeteners, which are increasingly used in things that are touting themselves as low sugar, no sugar, etc., do disrupt the microbiome. And, there's studies after studies showing that, and also that people that consume them ultimately seem to end up not being any lighter, which is the irony of the whole thing. And I think people need to, again, just be aware that artificial sweeteners are something to watch out for. Just yesterday, I was doing an interview for the BBC about the latest diet advice that has come out. And the guy is interviewing, he's saying, look, the way we are now is ready meals, processed meals, it's takeaways. And I say, yes, well, we've just got to get better than that, So that's where I stand on this, just trying to improve where people are.
It's a bit of a minefield out there, I think, for people to understand what to do.
And also the calorie count issue, which is something I find very frustrating because we have a campaign here which was trying to encourage children to choose snacks that were under 100 calories. And when schools started to get involved in that, and a child is being told that they can't, for example, bring in some crackers and cheese because that's over 100 calories, but they can bring in a cereal bar, which is full of artificial sweeteners, preservatives, refined grains, no fiber. That is concerning because we really are sending children the wrong message and we're losing our ability to eat intuitively, to make decisions about what our body really needs.
Tell me, what do you think about this obsession with calories versus actually just eating good food?
To a degree, I like the work of Dan Buettner in Blue Zones. I don't agree that we should all be on a 100% plant-based diet. I think we do need meat in our diet. But I do think what's really interesting is we look at the places in the world where people have the lowest rates of obesity, for example, the Nordic countries, where they seem to live the longest. For example, Japan. They have a culture around food which is intuitive. The Okinawan phrase, haribachu, eat to 80% full. I think that's great. It's about eating seasonally. So, not eating food that's traveled halfway around the world. There was a stage in my clinic where I just seemed to be getting one person after another who had been on a very, very low calorie diet, who came in whose thyroid had been affected by going on a very, very low calorie diet for a long period of time. And that was a real eye opener because suddenly you realize that if people start doing the whole, well, if this is how many calories I need to eat because I'm expending this many, they're not being true to what their body actually needs. And not only are they nutritionally deficient, but they start to change their hormone profile. They can even change gene expression, and that's concerning. And certainly it's changing the microbiome. If we start eating foods that are in many cases full of artificial sweeteners, that are devoid of fiber or refined and processed, we are not for a moment thinking about what's going on inside the body. We're just thinking about a short-term fix for the outside of the body.
What do you think about the emotional stress that comes with doing that kind of regimen and being so obsessed about what we eat and how much of it we're eating and calories and all of that?
Yeah, I think that just raises stress levels. And as we know, high levels of stress affects sleep. Low levels of sleep affects stress, and those two things combined can affect many aspects of health, including your hormone profile. And, those that, if you look at the microbiome of shift workers and of people that work in the airline industry, so, pilots and stewardesses and stewards, they tend to have some of the worst balance of bacteria in their gut because of the nature of their work, the shift patterns, the jet lag. But we do need to understand that those things are going against the circadian rhythm. They're going against the normal rhythm of the body. And therefore, we need to try and get back to normal as soon as we can. And, we can't, again, a bit like losing weight, we can't fast track that process. We've got to listen to our bodies.
Why do you think people are so disconnected from what's going on in their bodies?
I think we just live in such a fast-paced community, a fast-paced life at the moment. I think people are so affected by the messages that they receive. I don't think they're just the advertising messages as we used to think they were. They are subliminal messages from our teens looking at images on Instagram and watching, tacky programs on the TV. That's my opinion, about, body image and this is the way you should look and this is the way you should be and this is the way you should behave. And we're so focused on the one outward image of our bodies that's where the disconnect has occurred. There was a phrase I read the other day of something about the issue with weight is don't make weight the issue, and that's the point. If we stop thinking about our weight and our image and we start thinking, for example, and I've always said this to parents with children, if you've got something, whether it's the quality of their hair, whether it's making sure that they make that next hockey match, or whether it's a skin issue, focus on something, but don't focus on their weight, and then we can start thinking about energy and we can start thinking about vitality and we start thinking about feeling good within yourself, feeling confident, and then weight will just happen. The right weight, the optimal weight might not be what they look like on the TV, but it'll be right for you.
What I don't like is this unrealistic expectation of what health is. So you have people who are doing yoga in bikinis, who are, posting perfect pictures of them all the time about their perfect life, and then that is seen as health.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
So I have a teenager now, a female, so a daughter who's 14, and I can see how differently that generation is using social media. And I'm not going to say to their advantage. I think there are advantages of using social media, for sure. I think there are. But I think you're right. The messages that they're receiving in terms of the ideal body shape, in terms of the ideal life, they're very unrealistic. And certainly, when people are getting paid by brands, and I know, it can happen. I can get given food, for example, and asked to promote it, but I will not work with any brand that I do not 100% agree with, the ethics of, the quality of the product and whether it actually does work. But I do think a lot of these people, because they become so influential, are influencing our next generation, particularly through the likes of Instagram, which are very visual imagery, in a potentially threatening way, because they don't listen to mum or dad, they listen to their peers. And if they're listening to their peers who are uneducated or uninformed, or potentially even touting sort of dangerous information, then they could be going down the wrong path.
So tell me about your book, Gut Health and Probiotics.
There's a lot of research in there. There's a lot of studies that are referred to in there. And I wanted people to be able to make the connections between the diverse body systems and ailments and gut health. For example, I don't work with a lot of autistic children. I have done, but I don't work with a lot now. I have an amazing person that I refer them on to, and she specializes in that. But I was fascinated by, the statistics that tell me that 90% of autistic children, or those on the autistic spectrum, have gastrointestinal problems. I was fascinated by the fact that 85% of children on the autistic spectrum have constipation. I don't think we can say that there isn't a correlation between autistic spectrum disorders and the microbiome and a gut dysbiosis. And, for example, the study that was carried out in 2006 by Reading University, it kind of went down in history because they had to sort of abandon it. Because what they did is they split people into, there was 40 children between the ages of 4 and 13, I believe, and they split them in two, and they gave one the probiotic and they gave the other the placebo, but they wanted to switch them over, and they realized that these guys that were getting the probiotic realized they were onto a good thing. They realized that what they were being given actually was really helping stool consistency, behavioral, overall digestive wellness of their children, and they didn't want to go on to the other thing. They wanted to make sure they stayed with, so they came off the trial and started to work out and source the probiotic themselves because it was doing so much good for their children. And I find that fascinating, So I think with, autism is really a really important connection to make. I think certainly when we looked at the state of the microbiome prior to vaccination, that's an interesting one. Does anybody actually look at, if you are going to vaccinate your children, what the state of the microbiome is prior to that? No, we don't. And we know from studies that the state of the microbiome when you are vaccinated makes a huge difference to how effective that vaccine is and possible side effects. So I think that's a really important connection. Making a connection between even things like, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, people just haven't done that. And to be able to show people that there is a connection, and if any of these things affect you, whether it's gut health, whether it's skin health, psoriasis, acne, rosacea, whether it's depression, anxiety, just don't look at putting a plaster over it. Don't look at just medication, because you could be denying yourself a huge opportunity here to address the underlying cause and be, medication free. And I'm not suggesting anybody comes off any medication, but I am suggesting that they just look at this thing called the gut, which is so undervalued and so, underestimated, I think, in the general medical profession.
You've heard a lot of client stories throughout this series, and you might be wondering if we could perhaps help you. Supporting people to shift is what we do best. Health is a journey, and we can help you to navigate this with one-on-one support with our clinical naturopaths, hypnotherapists and counsellors. If working with us one-on-one interests you, go to theshiftclinic.com and click on Shift with Us.
The Shift!
So tell me, why the lunchbox doctor? How did that come about?
Yeah, so when my daughter went to primary school, well, actually, one of the reasons I chose that primary school was because I went to look at the school lunches and I thought, oh, wow, they look amazing. We were able to go in and sit with them and have lunch with them. But it was just so many white carbs. And she was coming out of school. She was absolutely ravenous. And I thought, well, that's not right. And clearly something's out of balance here. And for me, it was, her blood sugar was all over the place because essentially she was going to school and having pasta with garlic bread. And I thought, oh, this isn't good. And we didn't eat that way at home. And we also didn't, when I looked at the packed lunches that other people were providing, we didn't eat like that either. She didn't really eat bread. So to go to school and to start having what was typical at that time, if we look at the research, it's either a white bread, ham, cheese or jam sandwich. It's a packet of crisps, it's a chocolate bar, and it's a fruity yogurt which has got sugar in it. So all of those things combined, there really isn't much that it's providing from a nutritional perspective. So I started writing a little bit online about this. I called it Not Just Sandwiches. So it wasn't, just sandwiches. And it started to get a bit of following. People started to say, well, this is really interesting because we've had the same issue. We don't want our children eating rubbish. And we look around and that's not the sort of thing. The things you buy in supermarkets that say ideal for lunchboxes are not ideal for lunchboxes. And I said, yes, that's right. So I started producing recipes and tips. And then in 2013, they brought out a new policy. The government were bringing in a new policy that was going to ban packed lunchboxes from schools because they thought, we'll take control. Nanny state, we'll manage it, we'll deliver everyone a really healthy school meal. And that's when I sort of stepped into I went on to a lot of TV shows and sort of became known as the UK's lunchbox expert, whatever that means, because, really, what is that? But I went around and just sort of said, well, lunchboxes are a thing and we need to have the opportunity. There's so many children with allergies and intolerances and whatever. But that aside, me as a parent, I want to be able to have the option, the choice of what my children eat. And even now, my daughter's 14. She makes her own lunchboxes now. But they are far more nutritious than what she could get at school, hands down. And my son the same. I make sure that he has people coming over to him, and it's not weird and different, but it's just making sure that it's real food. But people are quite interested by, what have you got today? And inevitably, it's nothing, from my mind, very fancy. It's leftovers from the night before, or, it's just a nice, flapjack or a slice or savoury slice that I've made, or a frittata. It's nothing too difficult, but it's just real food.
So tell me, what should be in a healthy lunchbox?
Yeah, so I break it down into 6 components, and I say it should be a healthier form of carbohydrate. And by that, I mean our complex carbohydrates as opposed to our refined carbohydrates. And there should be some protein in there. A lot of people don't actually think about lunch as an opportunity to provide the fuel that the child really needs. You're going to school for a whole day. You've got to concentrate to the end of that last period. So protein is absolutely key for that. Actually, calcium, albeit that people think, we get all our calcium from dairy, if a child can't have dairy, but there are other ways we can get calcium into our body. So sufficient calcium, vegetables, fruit, and a drink. I have so many people come to me and say, well, my child will only have this sandwich on this bread or this sandwich on this bread. I said, well, take out the sandwich, get a flask, soup, leftover bolognese, whatever it is, some homemade baked beans or something. It really doesn't have to be that complicated. Protein can come from vegetable sources, animal sources, from anything from cold meats to the leftover roast chicken from the weekend or whatever it is. The vegetables can be as diverse as you like, but we know that statistically children are much more likely to eat their vegetables if they're served alongside a dip, and if we vary them. So just keep it varied. Fruit doesn't have to be eaten in its whole form. It could be eaten in a smoothie or a drink, or it could be pureed. So there's so many ways to provide a very it doesn't have to get boring. It does take a bit of preparation, and I provide people with lots of planning techniques and tips on how to do it, and that's what I'm writing my current book about.
That's exciting. Why do we need to look to children to improve the health of our nation, but also our gut health collectively?
So children are the future, they're tomorrow, and certainly I do think it's a generational thing, and I think a whole generation missed out on a whole load of knowledge around actually cooking from scratch. It used to be that cooking from scratch was a technique which was passed down without people realizing it from generation to generation. And it's certainly, I know in my generation, we had a political leader in this country who basically said, women should be out at work. They don't need to be taught how to cook. So that whole subject just seemed to be wiped off any curriculum. And we weren't taught how to cook, particularly those that were quite academic and were looking at sort of university. It's like, why do they need to know how to cook? Well, we do, actually, quite frankly. But our children, I believe, can turn that around. And it's so empowering. I actually do a bit of work with GB athletes. Now they have, and they're often the teenagers that are on the verge of, big things. And they have a great incentive to want to eat well, which is fantastic. And they take it really seriously. But what I love seeing when I work with these athletes, quite often they'll come to workshops with their parents. Their parents will come and see me as a group. The children will come and see me as a group, and I'll work with them. And then the parents will come back months later and they'll say, wow, what have you done? Because the children are educating the parents about what their bodies need and how they need to be getting that from, real food sources, what they need to be putting into a recovery drink, what they need to be eating before a match, how they're going to keep going for the tournament all day on Saturday. And I think our children have a total capacity to help educate up, but I also think educate out, and from my perspective, that's about if those parents are interested, or coaches are interested, or teachers are interested, which I think they all are, is helping children become the educators, showing by example that eating healthily is not something to be laughed at. It's something to be embraced, and look at the people that are, look how good they are.
One of the things that you said early on was really interesting, which is around wanting to blame something rather than taking responsibility. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's very much within our culture, is not willing to accept blame for something that you've done, or something that's happened. And certainly as parents, no parent wants to be told that they may have done something wrong in bringing up their children, and they will get very, very angry about that and sort of close down any opportunity to listen. I'm a parent, and if people sort of even, intimate that I may have done something wrong, even if I agree with them, I'm going to turn my back slightly, aren't I? I'm going to be slightly angry. And so I understand it totally, but I think the reality is, don't leave it too late, because if you do, our children could be getting more sick if we don't take this seriously enough. So I think in our culture we have this sort of thing where we want to say, oh, it's not me, it must be this. But the reality is we can take some of this on. We just have to sort of say, look, this is something that I may have either got wrong or I may not have understood fully. And I think that's the latter is probably the more important thing. Just say, I didn't understand it fully at the time, but now I understand more, I can do something about it.
What's something that's really bugging you right now?
Oh gosh, right. So many things are bugging me right now. So I feel probably, and it's related to what I do for work, but focus on calorie counting, the number of teenagers that are focusing so heavily on their looks, the boys that are trying to bulk up, trying to sort of take protein powders, telling their mums that they're not having any carbohydrates in their diet, they just want protein, but they don't really know what they're doing, and desperate parents coming to me and saying, what on earth do I do with this? So I think but that's really bugging me, this sort of the fact that we don't have and I don't believe one size fits all, but the fact that we don't have the same information going to everyone, the fact that it's so confusing for people, and the fact that it ends up with kids with eating disorders, including boys increasingly, kids with self-harming issues because they can't quite match up to what society tells them they should be, and the fact that we're so image-based bothers me greatly.
Yeah, me too. What do you think we should tell our children in terms of them just being themselves and loving themselves and being okay without worrying about what social media is trying to tell them?
I have a phrase that I use, and it's, don't try and compare yourselves to other people. I say compare yourself to your best you. And I think it's the most important message that we can give our children, because if they start looking at, body shape, body size, how bright someone is, how clever someone is, how many exams someone passes, they're not comparing themselves fairly, because you don't know what the starting point is. So you've got to just look at what is the best you can be, and that's about looking after your body. That's about getting enough sleep. That's about your mental well-being as well as your physical well-being. That's about being part of a family or a community and feel like you're belonging and contributing, being your best you.
If you were to give one piece of advice to somebody that wanted to make a shift in their health, what would it be?
I would say, if you're wanting to make a shift in your health, you are going to need to understand that it's going to take some time, and that it's going to be not just looking at one aspect of health. I always advise people to think of health in a triangle. So there's your mental well-being, and then there's your physical well-being in terms of activity or lack of activity, whatever it is. We need to make sure people are active to the right degree, and your nutrition. So those three aspects, to me, are the strongest aspects. You want a really strong, firm kind of bond between each of those points on the triangle. So mind, physical, in terms of exercise, and nutrition really are the areas that you're going to have to look at. And I don't think you can focus on any one of those with greater results than another. People talk about, how much nutrition affects this and how much, physical training affects that. But even if you did those two things, but your mindset wasn't in the right place, you're not going to get better. So those three areas have got to be focused on together.
Wow, we covered so much in that episode, so let's review some of the key points that you can take away with you. Number 1, we live in a culture where people are trying to fast track their health. Rather than seeing health as a journey, many of us are drawn towards the quick fix, a pill to mask the symptom or something to take us out of our pain as quickly as possible. I get why this occurs, but we've got to realise that there is no fast track to true health. It requires you to continually work on yourself for yourself. Number 2, we need to think about what we're feeding our infants and children as we introduce food. All too often, they're ending up on processed foods and miss out on the nutrients needed for optimum development. Only 1 in 10 children are having at least 5 serves of veggies a day, which really is not enough. Number 3, counting calories is not beneficial for your health. It's confusing and it takes away from the complexity that food actually gives you. Rather than focusing on calories, focus on where you are getting these from. The quality of your food and what it contains far outweighs the importance of hitting the right caloric intake. Knowing is great, but doing is better. Here are 3 things that you can do as a result of this conversation. If you have children or plan to in the near future, give them the best start to life by ensuring that you're also feeding their microbiome with a wide variety of plants such as vegetables, fruit, legumes, nuts, seeds, and gluten-free whole grains. Number 2, observe your thoughts around weight and image. Do you have a healthy relationship with yourself? Perhaps you need to review the input that you're getting. Look at the shows that you're watching and cut anyone from Instagram and Facebook that doesn't show up as realistic and empowering. The last thing you want to do is be looking at pictures of someone's unrealistic, perfect life. Keep it real. Number 3, if you're packing kids' lunches, remember, there are much better options out there. Be a little creative and try adding things like leftovers, casseroles in a flask, and frittatas to mix it up. Watch out for refined carbohydrates like breads, cookies, biscuits, crackers, and processed food, and load it up on healthy, fresh fruit, vegetables, nuts, and seeds. Jenny's new book, Real Lunchtime Foods, comes out in December, and I'm so excited to get a copy. We've provided a link to Amazon in the show notes so that you can pre-order yours. I really enjoyed chatting to Jenny, and I hope you've gained some insights from this episode too. If you loved it, please share on social media and be sure to tag myself and the Lunchbox Doctor so that we can say hi. You can connect with Jenny Tschiesche on Facebook or visit her website lunchboxdoctor.com. That's lunchboxdoctor.com. In the next episode of The Shift, we move from the UK to Seattle, Washington, where we'll hear from nutritionist Angela Pfeiffer. Angela is a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO specialist, which is a condition that's on the rise, so this information will be relevant for so many of us.
Coming up on The Shift.
What are some of the most common things you see going wrong with people's guts?
I would say an immense amount of stress and the load on their system.
So tell me, what causes SIBO?
Lots of things cause SIBO. So I think we have to step back for just a second and say that SIBO is a secondary condition. It's not a primary condition.
So tell me, if it's not about food, what is it about?
It's going to be something different for each person.
Have you listened to Season 1 of The Shift? If you're enjoying the expert series, you'll love Season 1, where we deep dive into the field of gut health with 25 of the world leaders in this area. Head back to your podcast app and find Episode 1. It's a great place to start.